NBR columnist Brigitte Morten says it's time for political parties to catch up with the science and embrace genetic engineering. She joins me now. Of course, one of the parties that's absolutely opposed to genetic modification, genetic engineering, whatever we want to call it, is the Green Party.
Yeah, absolutely, and a bit of a stickler, particularly with the current government arrangements about any progress being made in this space. The Greens, it's almost part of their brand. It was about 20 years ago that we had the massive sort of debate in New Zealand that led to the current legislation that we have in place, and the Greens were really at the forefront of that and making sure we had really strict, almost a ban against genetic modification.
And yet, obviously there's stuff around genetic engineering, the science, and actually that will help with climate change, why not?
Yeah, that's the biggest argument, is that actually in that 20 years we've learned a lot more about the risks and how to manage those risks, but actually a lot more seen the rewards. And it's coming from scientists that are really asking the government to make the changes so that they can look at things that make us have a more sustainable food environment, that deal with the agricultural emissions in particular, and alternative proteins as well. Those kind of key things that the government has said we need to look at to develop our climate change strategy, and these could be found in genetic modification or genetic engineering.
But the other political parties, though, haven't really been that keen to take up the cudgels on behalf of GE technologies, have they?
No, I think you're seeing a little bit, obviously the Labor government has said that, they're happy to have an informed discussion as their response to this, which obviously I think you've got to look at the politics of it in terms of the Greens. They're going to need them for support if they're next in government. They do need them for support. They don't need them, but they want them for support at the moment. So that does stop that debate somewhat. But you don't also have other parties sort of jumping up. I think the ACT Party's got a pretty sort of liberal policy on wanting, less regulation in this space, but it's not a big platform for them. And this is kind of one of the issues, that sort of society's moved on and the science has moved on, but the big political debate hasn't, and it hasn't kind of got to that point yet where people are ready to act.
Why not? Because I think we had the former science advisor to the Prime Minister say that we need to open up to this. And in fact, I think the current one is also much open to a debate and to use. And if the science says, that these things are effective, why wouldn't politicians and the government follow suit?
Yeah, this is always a difficulty. I think there's probably a bit of memory of the sort of debate 20 years ago. I'm not sure how much you remember that, but it was when I was at university, and I really remember that billboard of, the woman with the genetic engineered milked like a cow. That was quite an iconic sort of piece. And there was a lot of debate and a lot of concern and a lot of fear-mongering about it. And I think there's not necessarily the appetite from political parties. They don't see that there's enough reward politically to open up that debate and have to have that discussion about those sort of boundaries. But there's a difference between the sort of politics at a sort of big P, the beehive, parliament kind of political level. What you really need is some of that work starting to happen actually behind the scenes. Your Ministry of the Environment, MPI, all of those departments that should be pushing this type of legislative change along should be providing the framework to try and get the political parties to come on board.
But in times of a crisis, and I'm thinking, for instance, the COVID-19 pandemic, obviously there were some people who poo-pooed the idea of vaccinations and what have you, but the government and most politicians said, follow the science, and yes, we vaccinated. We've got a crisis, a climate crisis that everyone talks about, and there seems to be suggestions that some of this technology could help in reducing emissions, particularly, say, on-farm emissions. Why not follow the science?
Yeah, well, absolutely. And this is, I think, one of the key opportunities that the Greens are actually missing here, is that they actually, I think, have a real opportunity to step up, show that they have actually listened to the science, like they say that they do, have listened to the scientists who are pushing them in particular to change their stance, and actually say, we are so concerned about climate change that we are happy to go back on something and relook at something that has been a key part of our platform and our brand for many, many decades, because this is how serious it is. But you almost need something like that, like the Greens, to push that along, to put it back into the public debate for the other parties to go, okay, we have to engage in the space, because it's really for the Greens to demonstrate their climate change credentials on this.
But if we get a change of government next year, won't a national ACT government look more seriously at this?
I think they probably will look more seriously at it. You kind of see those signals that that's something that they would look more seriously at. I think they'll probably do it in that they've kind of got two ways that they'll do it in a more nuanced way. They'll have more research grants, being more sort of applications and things getting through, or even more funding for GE-based products or processes. But I think what you're really looking for is actually like an enabling structure to happen, and you've just got to look at what's currently before sort of an incoming National Act government, and they've got some pretty big reforms to deal with that are clearly just ahead of the queue than genetic modification.
Brigitte Morten, thank you for your time.